All right, this morning we continue our study. We're in Luke chapter 7 today. We're going to be taking a look at kind of the first two incidents that are recorded here in chapter 7. And that's going to be, I guess we could say it's two healings if you can. It's the Jesus encountering the Centurion and his request for healing for his servant. And then Jesus raising the son of a widow in the city of Nain. And so we're going to be looking at these two events today. And so join me in Luke chapter 7, verse 1. We'll begin there. It says, "Now when he," this is Jesus, "concluded all his sayings in the hearing of the people," and this is going to be the conclusion of chapter 6. I know this is brilliance coming forth, that chapter 7 begins right on the heels of the end of chapter 6. But in chapter 6, we had been looking at this teaching, whether you look at it as a comparable teaching to the Sermon on the Mount, or if you look at it as the Sermon on the Plain, as some people describe it, as recorded here in Luke. Either way, this is some of the core teachings of Jesus as he was providing equipping for his disciples and what it looks like to live the life of a follower of Christ. So when he had concluded all of this in the hearing of the people, he entered Capernaum. Now that's probably a little bit of a clue that might have been the next closest place. Maybe, maybe not. Typically, if you are on a Holy Land tour and you're going to go to the location of the Sermon on the Mount. Well, no one knows where the Mount was, where the Sermon on the Mount really was there. But there is a church located on top of a hill that's considered, the Church of the Sermon on the Mount. But there's also a variety of other hills and valleys and other places, wherever. And so it's kind of really up to your tour guide to decide where the Sermon on the Mount was. But either way, wherever they take you, it's most likely not too far from Capernaum, meaning that it's within eyeshot. And in fact, if you're anywhere around the Sea of Galilee, you're within eyeshot of the vast majority of everything that happened in Jesus' ministry. Obviously not what happened in Jerusalem and other places, but the vast majority of Jesus' ministry took place in the Galilee region. And again, when you're there, you're just kind of looking across the lake or the Sea of Galilee, and you can see the other side and see the locations of everything around. Well, Jesus goes into Capernaum, and we see Capernaum as being Jesus' home base. We know that Jesus was raised in Nazareth, and he bears the name Jesus of Nazareth. But once he entered into his ministry, pretty much from the time of his baptism on, Capernaum is the place where he returns to. That's the place where he always is landing. We know that some of the disciples were from Capernaum. Peter's from Capernaum. And so he seems to always be going back there as kind of when it's time to go home, that's where he heads. And so he goes back to Capernaum. In verse 2, it says, "And a certain centurion's servant who was dear to him was sick and ready to die. So when he heard about Jesus, he sent elders of the Jews to him, pleading with him to come and heal his servant. And when they came to Jesus, they begged him earnestly, saying that the one for whom he should do this was deserving, for he loves our nation and has built us a synagogue. Then Jesus went with them, and when he was already not far from the house, the centurion sent friends to him, saying to him, 'Lord, do not trouble yourself, for I am not worthy that you should enter under my roof. Therefore, I did not even think myself worthy to come to you, but say the word, and my servant will be healed. For I also am a man placed under authority, having soldiers under me. And I say to one, go, and he goes, and to another, come, and he comes. And to my servant, do this, and he does it.' Verse 9, when Jesus heard these things, he marveled at him, and turned around and said to the crowd that followed him, 'I say to you, I have not found such great faith, not even in Israel.' And those who were sent, returning to the house, found the servant well, who had been sick." And so a phenomenal story. Sometimes you read through the Gospels, like, yep, there's another one. Jesus healed another one. And you can kind of get lost on just the fact that, yep, of course, he healed another one. It's kind of like that's just what he does any given day. He just goes about healing people. And you kind of lose the awe and the wonder of it. When we come to this specific encounter, yeah, there's a few uniquenesses to it that are worth throwing a little bit of a spotlight on, but there's one facet of this encounter that I think is really instrumental in understanding Jesus's healing, as well as the faith that so often is attributed to that healing power. And so we're going to take a look at that, of course, but as we go back and we'll pick up in verse 2, we've kind of covered the Capernaum in verse 1. In verse 2, we're dealing with a centurion, and so kind of one thing that is unique here is we're dealing, Jesus' encounter really with a Gentile here. There's really, I don't think, any speculation that this centurion, this Roman soldier, is a Jew who's, working as a centurion in the Roman army. Everyone understands that this is going to be a Gentile. And as a centurion, he's responsible for overseeing 100 Roman soldiers. And the centurions that are described in the New Testament are oftentimes described, or portrayed, I should say, as being individuals of honor, that they're individuals who obviously have great power and great authority. And as a centurion in the Capernaum area, this would be really the guy who's kind of the military leader over that region. Now, keep in mind that there were continual tensions between Israel and Rome. Okay, the Jews were consistently despising the very presence of Roman authority in the Promised Land. This was their land. Of course, they've lost control of their land because of their own disobedience, having been sent into captivity, and from the Babylonian captivity up through the New Testament and beyond. They had consistently been living under the rule or the authority of a foreign government, whether that was Babylon, whether that's Persia, whether that's Greece, or here in the New Testament, Rome. And you can kind of just go through the rest of history seeing that the Jews living in what we call the Promised Land in Israel were consistently living under the rule of a foreign power. And that was always a source of tension because the land had been promised to them. Not only had the land been promised to them, but God had raised up kings to rule over them. In all of those times of living under the rule and reign of foreign powers, they did not have a throne for Israel, nor did they have a descendant of David sitting upon that throne. But that king will come and take up his residence once again in Jerusalem, sitting on the throne of David as the king not only over Israel, but when that king comes, and his name is Jesus, when he comes again, he will rule not only over Israel, but over all of the nations, because he will come as the King of all kings and the Lord of all lords. And so as Israel was anticipating and awaiting the Messiah to come and bring that freedom, they're living under the rule of these foreign powers, Gentile powers, okay? And so there's a variety of tensions that are taking place here. For one, they're not living freely in their own sovereignty. They don't have their own king. They don't have their own government. Rome was very gracious in allowing Israel to govern their religious affairs in that context. But for the most part, there were tensions that existed. And there were always tensions between Jews and Gentiles, regardless of Rome, regardless of soldiers, regardless of governments. Gentiles and Jews did not typically get along because the Jews had the perspective that the Gentiles were unclean, okay? And for good reason. You go back through the Old Testament, you'll see the laws, the instructions, God's emphasis on being sanctified, that is set apart from the nations around you. God did not want his people to be influenced by the ungodly. That remains true to this day. But how you apply that, how you live that out is a whole nother matter. And so for the Jews, they despised the Gentiles, and all the more Rome, because it was kind of a double whammy. Not only are they defiled Gentiles, but they're ruling over us, okay? So when we come into this situation, that's like some general background right there. When we come into this specific situation, though, there's something wildly unique at work with this specific centurion, okay? Clearly, he's in charge over that region. But as we read through, kind of skipping a little bit ahead in verse 5, we do discover, we'll get there, we'll come back to it, but just for the sake of finishing up this background, this specific centurion was well received by the Jewish community. And so obviously he had done some community relations building, right? Actually some physical building. It says that the elders of Capernaum said that this man he loves our nation. That is, that he has a great regard for the nation of Israel, for us as Jews. And he also has built us a synagogue. Okay, and so he has funded this project of building a synagogue for them. So either this man, this centurion, is either a lover of God, or he's very shrewd in recognizing it's good to be in good with these people. It'll keep peace in the region. the region of Galilee, there were continual conflicts throughout the nation of Israel. Oftentimes we focus on 70 AD, on the destruction of the temple by the Romans. But that was really just the pinnacle of the climax, or of the conflict, I should say, between Rome and Israel. That for years prior to that, there were conflicts where Israel was rising up in rebellion against Rome's authority over them. And so trying to maintain the peace, this is the centurion's role and responsibility. But he seems to have this love for the Jewish people, and he's pouring into the community by having this synagogue built. I guess just while we're on that, if you take again another Holy Land tour, it can be the same tour as the Sermon on the Mount, but you'll swing on through Capernaum, and of course you'll get to visit the remains of the synagogue there in Capernaum. They're standing to this day. It's not the same synagogue from Jesus' day. The synagogue that you'll walk through today was built, I don't know, I think around the year 300 AD or somewhere around there. But what's cool is as you're looking at that, and a good tour guide will point this out to you. If they don't, there's a sign on the side of the synagogue that points this out to you. But it points out that there's a different colored stone that's used as the foundation. It's a dark stone, whereas the rest of the synagogue that you're walking through is a more of a whitish sort of a cream-colored stone that's used. But that dark stone are the foundations of the original synagogue that was there from the New Testament era. That would be this centurion's donation. Okay? So it's kind of cool. When I love reading through the gospel, standing there in the Holy Land and being like, that guy built that thing. That guy did this. This is the centurion's work, And so you can see that. There's a couple other spots you can walk through, and you'll look down into some excavated areas, and you can see sections of the original, at least one section of the original synagogue down there as well. This is that centurion. He has built that synagogue in that city of Capernaum. And so as we come back to our passage here, it says, again, verse 2, there's a certain centurion servant who was dear to him. This is probably another unique facet of this situation, which reveals a lot about this man, because under Roman law, a Roman could put their servant or their slave to death, and it was not an uncommon practice to do so if their servant became ill and was of no use to them anymore. And so servants or slaves were very much just looked at as, it's a tool, and if this tool's broken, then toss it out. And so it would have been the norm for him to just have this servant who's deathly ill just put to death and replaced. But this guy has a heart for his servant, and he has a heart for God's people. We don't know how far that heart reaches, whether that's a heart for God himself or not. But you can see within this individual, just in these little details that are revealed here, that this is a guy who obviously has some kind of a connection, some kind of a desire for God, an awareness of God. He's unique from a lot of the other Roman soldiers, and even centurions, honorable men, but few who are described in the likeness of this man. And so here he is. He has a servant who is sick, but he's dear to him and is ready to die. Verse 3, so when he, the centurion, heard about Jesus, he sent elders to the Jews to him, pleading with him to come and heal his servant. Now, the reality is that this centurion, if he's the guy in Capernaum, then he's probably already well familiar with who Jesus is, because Jesus has already been on the scene for some time. He's already caused quite the commotion, okay? But it might be that he's never given a whole lot of attention to him, or at least not perceived that he has a need for Jesus until his servant whom he loves is taken ill. And so it's possible that while Jesus has been away, be it on the mountain or out in the plain or wherever it is that he's been teaching, in chapter 6, that it's in that span of time that the centurion's servant is taken ill. And as he's ill, he's thinking, what am I going to do? Jesus isn't around. And when Jesus comes back into Capernaum, and again, Luke points the emphasis that he's entered back into Capernaum, that this is when the centurion takes action. And what the centurion does is the centurion, and Luke records this for us. Both Matthew and Luke both give us an account of the centurion and his servant and Jesus' healing of him, okay? But Luke gives us a few more details than Matthew records. But just while we're on this little situation of the two Gospels, Matthew does record something that you don't really see in Luke's account, and that is that Matthew records that Jesus actually encounters the centurion. When you read through this in the Gospel of Luke, you'd think that the two guys never meet, because Luke records about how Luke goes to the elders of the city, and the elders of the city go to Jesus. And then as Jesus decides to make his way to go on down to the centurion's house, before he even gets there, the centurion sends some of his friends almost to kind of cut him off and tell him, no, you really don't have to come here. And we'll get into all of that, okay? But Matthew does make it very clear that Jesus and the centurion at some point are face to face and they're talking, okay? There's a little tiny nuance in the original language in verse 6. It doesn't come through in the English at all, okay? And in fact, maybe even in the Greek, you might not pay a whole lot of attention to it. But in verse 6, there's a shift in the grammar that's being used as if the centurion and Jesus are speaking face to face. And it's perfectly right to come to that conclusion because that's how Matthew describes it. Okay, and so a lot of times when you're reading through the gospel accounts and you're reading through two different accounts of the same event and they read differently and you're kind of going, oh my goodness, the Bible and its contradictions, I was always told it doesn't have any. What am I going to do now? Okay, don't freak out, don't panic. Okay. The vast majority of the time, we just look at it and we realize that these are just two different accounts. It's almost, you've got two different witnesses that are watching the same thing. Of course, Luke is not an eyewitness to these events. Luke's account is from pulling from different other eyewitnesses' accounts and putting it all together, which is why, on occasion, Luke gives us a few more details than we find in the other Gospels. And that's exactly what happens here. We're getting more details through Luke's account than what Matthew provides. Matthew provides the conversation that takes place between Jesus and the centurion. Luke provides not only the conversation, but the other people who were involved in parts of those conversations, meaning that not all of the conversation took place face to face. Some of it happened through messages sent through other people. With that said, let's come back to the passage here. Verse 3, so when he heard about Jesus, he sent elders of the Jews to him, pleading with him to come and heal his servant. This is another fascinating thing, because here's this centurion, and who is he going to? He's going to the Jewish leaders in Capernaum. Now, of course, we would expect them to have some kind of relationship. They're both leaders, spiritual leaders, governmental leaders, okay? And so they've got to have some kind of working relationship. That's not to say that it has to be a good working relationship, but they know each other and they know how to get a hold of each other. And so on this occasion, either A, the centurion has a great working relationship with the elders and feels comfortable coming to them, asking them this favor, or B, the centurion knows that he's got all the power and authority that he needs, and he flexes it a little bit and says, if you're wise, you'll help me out here. Because there's this miracle worker, and you guys know who he is, and I want you to go talk to him. I'm opting with A, because A fits in with everything else we're seeing of this centurion and his regard for the people of Israel in building, the synagogue for them and so forth. And yet the elder's response is fascinating too, because this is the response of Jewish leaders responding to a Gentile, and it's no longer just about government. This isn't about taxes anymore. This isn't about curfews. This is now about the centurion needs a personal favor, and he's coming to us asking us to go to Jesus on his behalf, and they seem eager to do so, which reveals something about the elders in Capernaum, doesn't it? Either A, you like all of these A's and B's in this sermon today? It's like the alphabet message, Either A, these guys were believers in Jesus and had been sold out on him and said, yeah, we know Jesus, we'll go talk to him for you. Or B, these are the guys who are skeptics going, oh no, now we're caught between a rock and a hard place. We think Jesus is a heretic, but the centurion who's got, pulling all of the big strings around here is asking us to go to him, and I guess we better go to him. But I'm going to go with A, because it seems that Jesus is well received in Capernaum. This isn't Jerusalem. Okay, we see all kinds of tensions happening there, and a lot of times the tensions are people who are being sent from Jerusalem out to Jesus to harass him, to try to get him tripped up in his theology or in his words. And so it really is a beautiful picture, okay, of Jesus coming into town, a Roman centurion who's in need, going to the Jewish elders and saying, would you please go entreat Jesus on my behalf, that he may come and heal my servant who is dear to me. And so they're pleased to do this. And it says in verse 4, when they came to Jesus, they begged him earnestly saying that the one for whom he should do this was deserving. They go on and they describe about how he loves their nation, how he's built them this synagogue. But it really does reveal human thinking, doesn't it? Because in our human thinking, we oftentimes think of who's deserving and who's not deserving. And for them, they're thinking, this guy is a big donor. He's deserving. This guy has authority over us. We should probably appease him. But their words declare that he loves our nation. He loves our people, and so he's deserving. This isn't just some Gentile. This is a Gentile who loves us and who cares for us, and so he's deserving. But it does open up the question in our mind theologically, well, who is deserving of anything from the hand of God? And the answer is that nobody is deserving. Not one of us are deserving of any good gift that our Father gives. But our Father gives good gifts to those who are undeserving. That's one of the greatest perspectives, one of the great truths. It's the doctrine of grace at work. And it really is a beautiful definition of God himself. That God is a gracious God, and he gives good gifts to the undeserving. If it wasn't true, then Jesus would never have come. If it wasn't true, a cross would only be a symbol of criminals, but instead it has become the symbol of salvation. It has become the symbol of deliverance. It has become the symbol of mercy. It's the symbol of God's grace, because he has laid down his own life for the undeserving. And so, for those of us who know the grace of God, even just reading this account and hearing these Jews say, oh, he's deserving of this great thing, we kind of go, well, yeah, he seems like a great guy. And you know what? In human perspective, I'm sure he was far more deserving than a lot of the other people who Jesus healed, from a human perspective. But from a godly perspective, they're all undeserving. From the best of them to the worst of them, in a human assessment, they're all just as undeserving. But yet by his grace, Jesus comes, and he loves, and he heals. They beg him in verse 4, saying he's deserving. Verse 5, they describe, for he loves our nation and has built us a synagogue. In verse 6, then Jesus went with them. And when he was already not far from the house, the centurion sent friends to him, saying to him, Lord, do not trouble yourself, for I am not worthy that you should enter under my roof. And so I know I had mentioned verse 6 before as kind of being this little nuance in the original of the Greek there that's at work. And you don't really see it in the English. But verse 6 is different, say, from back in verse 3 when he sends the elders on his behalf. Because in verse 6, the original Greek does portray that this is a conversation that's happening as if the centurion is addressing Jesus directly. At some point in this dialogue, that seems to be what happens as we bring Matthew's account into, factor into how this works out. I think that it's really helpful. For me, I choose to read through Luke's account here in verse 6 and just realize that, yeah, this is a face-to-face dialogue that's taking place at some point, okay? But as we're kind of laying this out, how does this look like? Okay, the centurion inquires of the elders. The elders go to Jesus. Jesus says, sure, sounds great. He decides to go to the centurion's house, okay? As he's going to the centurion's house, the centurion sends friends as messengers to intercept him. And the message, well, either A, the friends come to intercept him and the message isn't recorded for us, or you're going to read the message as being at least the beginning part of the latter part of verse 6 where it says, Lord, do not trouble yourself, for I am not worthy that you should enter under my roof. Now, obviously, all of that is in like the first person. It's not like the messengers are saying this of their own roof or of their own house, or it could be a written message, and he's written this out and he sent it to them. But either way, at some point, this does become a face-to-face encounter. But let's just look at the flow of communication here. Lord, do not trouble yourself, for I am not worthy that you should enter under my roof. This is great. Now, this centurion may be more astute to the Jewish dynamics than some other Gentiles, because there was in that animosity between Jews and Gentiles, there was the practice in the New Testament era and before, but definitely present then, that a Jew was not to go into a Gentile's house. You just didn't do that. You didn't go into their house. You didn't go under their veranda. You kind of just didn't go into their space, because their space was considered to be unclean or defiled because they were unclean. They weren't God's people. They practiced a variety of unclean things. They worshiped false gods, and so they were a defiled people, and therefore by getting too close to them, you yourself as a Jew would now be made defiled or unclean, and you'd have to go through some kind of ceremonial cleansing process before you could come back into the Jewish community again. And so for the most part, Jews didn't go down Gentile streets, you know. When you get further out from the religious elite, you would see Jews and Gentiles a little bit more closely interacting, okay? And so if you're in Jerusalem, you're going to see a very clear separation between them. If you're out in Capernaum, maybe you don't see as clear of a separation between Jews and Gentiles because they're sharing maybe some of the same marketplaces. But because this was a perspective that a Jew would not go into a Gentile's home or under his roof, and Jesus is a rabbi, the centurion is likely already thinking, this guy's not going to come under my roof because I'm a Gentile and he's a Jew, and Jews just don't do these sort of things. And so he responds and he tells him, as Jesus is on his way to his house, so this is already an extraordinary thing, Jesus is coming to his house, okay? But he responds and he sends the message, Lord, do not trouble yourself, for I am not worthy that you should enter under my roof. I'm not worthy. The Jewish elders are saying, oh, this man, he is worthy. He's worthy of this thing, Jesus. You should do this for him. But as for the man, he's saying, no, I'm not worthy. I'm not worthy to have you come under my roof. I'm not worthy to even come pursue you and ask you, which is why I went to the elders to have them talk to you. And so there's this very clear perspective of this Roman centurion that when it comes to the Lord Jesus Christ, I just am not worthy. He has a very high regard for Jesus. We're going to see his perspective unpack a little bit in this conversation with them, but clearly he has a greater regard for Jesus than even the elders in Capernaum have for him. The centurion perceives himself as being completely unworthy. The Jewish leaders see the centurion as being worthy. Okay? And our perspective of the Lord Jesus Christ or of God altogether, as far as am I worthy, is a good thing to examine and to assess. Am I worthy to come to the Lord Jesus Christ? You can say yes, and you'll be right, and you can say no, and you'll be right. Because in and of myself, I am not worthy. I am not worthy to come into his presence. I'm not worthy of his attention. I'm not worthy of his mindfulness. I'm not worthy of anything aside from perhaps his just judgment upon me. That's what I'm worthy of, because I am a sinner. But by the grace of God, through the sacrifice of Jesus, his son, and the blood being shed on my behalf, I, the unworthy, have now been made worthy. And so now I get to come boldly before his throne of grace. I get to come boldly before his throne of grace, because this is the kind of God that we serve. This is the kind of God that he is. Now, we don't come before him with an attitude of being worthy. That is to say that we don't approach his throne of grace in arrogance, as if I am God's gift to God. I'm not. God is his gift to me. And so we come humbly, meekly, knowing that I am completely undeserving. And this is what we see embodied in this Gentile Roman centurion. He comes with great honor and respect. He understands who he is and who he isn't when it comes to Jesus, which is impressive because this is the Roman centurion who probably carries the most weight in all of Capernaum. But he's not worthy to even come to Jesus, so he sends others to go talk to him for him. He's not worthy to have Jesus come to his house, and so he sends out his friends. He doesn't have to come here, but he comes anyways. Well, he doesn't make it all the way to the house. We'll see that in the context of the end of the story here, but he at least makes it to wherever this face-to-face encounter unfolds. He says, Lord, do not trouble yourself, for I am not worthy that you should enter under my roof. In verse 7, therefore, he continues, he says, therefore, I did not even think myself worthy to come to you. But say the word, and my servant will be healed. Everything up until that last line there has been all about how unworthy he is and why he never even came face to face to Jesus. But now he kind of shifts, and I think that it's important to make a distinction that this isn't just kind of like that neither of these posturings are making excuses for anything else. We want to take everything here on the level, okay? He says there in the second half of verse 7, but say the word, and my servant will be healed. Lord, you're on your way to my house where my servant is lying dying, but you don't even have to get to my house. You just say the word, and he'll be healed. You just speak it, and it'll happen. And then he explains the logic behind this. In verse 8, for I, this is the centurion speaking, for I also am a man placed under authority, having soldiers under me. And I say to one, go, and he goes, and to another, come, and he comes. And to my servant, do this, and he does it. In verse 8, the word also is actually one of the keys to this verse. Because what the centurion is communicating is that the centurion is a man under authority, but using the word also indicates that Jesus is also under authority. He recognizes, Jesus, you're under authority. I also am a man under authority. And then what does he say from that? He says, for I tell people what to do. When we come to the topic of authority, we recognize that there really is only one authority in all of existence, and it's God. God is the one sovereign, okay? He possesses authority. And from him, authority is delegated. God bestows or he delegates authority upon others. First and foremost is his son, Jesus the Christ. The authority of Jesus comes from the authority of God the Father. God the Father is the one who names Jesus the Son as King of Kings and Lord of Lords. God the Father is the one who tells the Son, you sit by my right hand until I make your enemies your footstool. Okay? All authority is given from the Father to the Son. Okay? And as we kind of continue our delegation of authorities, we see through the scriptures, and I think that it's okay to probably see it as all flowing from the Father to the Son and from the Son to other places. But if you don't agree with that, that's okay. If you want to see kind of like a direct delegation from the Father to other entities, that's fine too. But we see this delegation of authority that all comes from God. Okay? And so God delegates authority to Jesus the Son. He delegates authority to whatever extent to angelic beings. We really don't know that much about the authorities that angelic beings possess, but he has delegated authority to them. He has delegated authorities to mankind. That we know a bit more about because God speaks more about it through his word. We understand that he has delegated authority to those in governmental positions. God was the one who established the first king of Israel. Israel had no kings until God decided he was going to appoint a king. But even before the first king, King Saul, God had raised up what were referred to as judges throughout the time of the judges. Those were people who God raised up. He gave them authority. He had a particular calling upon their lives. Specific things were done. But we see God delegating that authority, and it's not just necessarily in the nation of Israel. Romans 13 gives us a pretty good exposition on the fact that God has delegated authority to mankind to govern. The kings are appointed by him. We also see God delegating authority in the spiritual sense. Priests that are appointed under the old covenant are delegated authority in their spiritual function. When we jump into the New Testament, we see the same thing happening in the New Testament church, that God has delegated authority to pastors, to overseers, to elders, to deacons, and so forth, that he's appointed an authority, a structure of authority, and we see it throughout all of creation. But even if we just focus on those delegated authorities that are clearly identified in the scriptures, we realize that all of these things are here, that all of these authorities, they flow from God. He's delegated authority to husbands in the context of their marriages. He's delegated authority to parents, mothers and fathers over their children in the context of the family unit. We look in a variety of places and we see authority put in place. All of those authorities are placed there by God, and all of those authorities flow from or are delegated from God himself. So authority always begins at the top, and it goes down through a flow of the chain of command. Delegated powers that the Lord establishes and is revealed in and through his word. Now, we're not surprised to see an attack on God-given authorities. We're not surprised to see authority attempting to be undermined. When we think of authority and the attack on authority, we oftentimes think of it in the context of rebellion. Satan is a great example of rebellion against God's authority. It was against God's authority that he says, I'm not going to submit, I'm going to do my own thing. And really Satan's whole agenda was to become like God. If I can unseat God and take that throne, I'd love to have it. So Satan is the example not only of rebellion against authority, but he's also the root and the source of an attack on authority that we see unfolding with even greater clarity in our days. And that is not just an attack of rebellion against authority, but an attempt to undermine or undo or eliminate the whole concept of authority as a whole. And we see this in our day and our age, whether it's the attempt to remove authority within the family unit, within the church, within governmental structures, within society. It's almost as if authority has become a bad word. It's as if like authority is somehow wrong or authority is unfair. It's unfair for someone to have authority and someone else to not have that same authority. Okay? But when we come back to the scriptures and we look at how God has laid out creation, he has set forth a structure of authority, and all of those authorities flow from him as its source or its origin. Please don't make the mistake of thinking simply because God has delegated the authority that those using that authority are using it wisely. Okay? Just because someone has authority does not mean that they're using it well. But simply because they're not using it well does not mean that God has not put the authorities in place. Each person in authority is responsible for every servant stands or falls before their own master. Okay? And so when we come back, though, to this attack, this undoing of authority, we see it everywhere in our society. And it probably doesn't take a genius to figure out that it's just a Marxist ideology that's permeated into a variety of different applications. It's the whole idea that it's just not fair. And it's no more fair than it was fair for God to have eyes to see the difference between good and evil, and Eve to not have those eyes. But she could see if she wanted to. All she had to do was rebel. And Adam just had to go along and rebel. They would have eyes to see, and so they did. But they didn't like what they saw. This attack on authority works its way in every direction. And the problem is that as this attack continues, it becomes more and more the norm, at least of our society. And as we make our way through society and this lack of authority becomes more and more apparent, we see continuing generations that are raised up. Our children, our grandchildren. And they go through life with absolutely no concept of what authority is or why it exists. And so this undoing of authority isn't just the undoing of a society. It's just not the undoing of Western civilization, although it's all of that. But it's not just that. It's a spiritual attack. And when you see everything that God has appointed being attacked, you know that's a spiritual attack. And it's not just an attack on those structures and entities that God has put in place and has delegated authority to, but it's an attack on God himself. Why? Because all authority flows from him. Yes. Okay? And so because all of the authority, because the authority of government is an authority granted by God, because the authority of a husband is an authority granted by God, because the authority of a mom over her children is an authority granted by God, any attack on any of those roles with the authority granted to them to carry out those roles is an attack on God himself. Because God has ordained those roles, he has ordained those positions, and he has granted the authority for those individuals in those places to carry out their responsibilities. And so when we see an attack on that, we realize that this is an attack on the whole spiritual situation altogether, the whole spiritual system, I should say, that God has established. And so there's a need to reclaim, or I'll say grow, in our awareness of God's authority. And when an individual grows in their awareness of God's authority over their own life, then that individual is going to have a personal revival. There's going to be a resurgence of lordship. We talked about that last week. That Jesus is master. He's the ultimate authority over my life. I may call him Lord, but if I don't do what he says to do, then I'm not living like he's my Lord. And so this whole issue of lordship is a matter of authority. And as we individually grow in our awareness of Jesus' authority, we will also individually grow in our practice and submission to his lordship. When we grow in an awareness of Jesus' authority over all things, not just us, but over all of creation, because Jesus is Lord over all. Okay? The centurion had authority over man. 100 soldiers, he had authority over them, and he could tell them to do anything, and they would go and they would do it. They understood authority. They didn't question authority. They didn't try to negotiate with authority. They just recognized, this is the man in authority, and if he says to do it, then I do it, and if I don't do what he says to do, then I'm either going to get locked up or beheaded. You know? It's great when authority has the power to follow up. Because then it's really simple for the people who are under the authority. Yeah, you just do it. You don't not do it. You just do it. But the centurion had authority over man. But Jesus, he has authority over all. Jesus has authority over all of creation. We see that when he calms the wind and the waves. Jesus has authority over all demons. We see that every time they tremble. We see that Jesus has authority over disease, over sickness, over ailments. We see it every time someone is healed. And we see that Jesus has authority over death itself every time he raises one from the dead. Jesus has authority. And when we grow in our awareness of that authority of Jesus, we will grow in our own confidence and trust in him. That is, we will grow in faith. This is my point. Is that when we come to the authority of Jesus, we're looking at one of the key mechanisms for growing in our personal faith. Because we realize Jesus has the authority to do this, and there's no one to oppose him. I don't have to wonder who's going to win the battle at the end of the age. I know the answer. I don't have to wonder if Jesus has authority over anything or anyone, because the answer is he is Lord of all. He has all the authority that the Father has bestowed upon him. So authority, understanding authority, is one of the keys, I believe, one of the keys. It might be a small key, but it's a key to help unlock our personal faith. That we can grow in our assurance, that we can grow in our trust in Jesus, that we can be more confident knowing that he is able. When we come back to our passage, it says in verse 9, when Jesus heard these things, he marveled at him and turned around and said to the crowd that followed him, I say to you, I have not found such great faith, not even in Israel. You know, if there was anyone who understood the authority of God and anyone who understood that you can trust the authority of God, you would think that it would be God's chosen people, the nation of Israel. That was seldom the case, though. When Jesus was in Nazareth, his hometown, and there were not many miracles performed there because of their lack of faith, it says that he marveled at their lack of faith. There's a couple of things that Jesus marvels at. One seems to be a lack of faith, but here Jesus is marveling at the faith of this Gentile. But what is it that unlocks his faith? The Gentile's understanding of how authority works. See, because he knows about authority, he understands. I say it and it happens. And what's cool about this Gentile is that he had eyes to see authority. And so when he saw Jesus, he saw a man with authority. And he says, you don't need to come to my house. You don't need to lay hands on him. You don't need to touch him. You don't need to do anything. For you have authority. You just say the word, and he will be healed. You don't have to come here. In the military sense, oftentimes orders are given, and the person giving the orders is not there with the boots on the ground to see it happen. They're just giving orders. The orders get delegated to whoever the troops are that are going to go out and execute whatever the mission is. But he's not standing there watching every order be fulfilled. He's just spouting them out. He's just speaking them. He's giving the commands. And so what this centurion says is he says, Lord, if you will just command, if you will just use the authority that you have, then my servant will be healed. And Jesus marvels at this because this guy gets it. He gets it. There's not a special formula. There's not a special incantation. There's not a special herb that has to be rubbed with a particular oil and a particular ratio and applied to a particular location in order for something spectacular to happen. He says, you just command it. You just speak it because you have authority. I know how authority works. I'm a man under authority. And being under authority means that authority has been delegated to me, and with the authorities I have received, I delegate them to others. I tell other people what to do. Lord, you just tell this sickness what to do, and it will happen. Again, verse 9, when Jesus heard these things, he marveled at him and turned around and said to the crowd that followed him, I say to you, I have not found such great faith, not even in Israel. The centurion could spot Jesus' authority, the Jews could not. They may have seen a great teacher. They may have seen a miracle worker, but it was almost as if their idea of Jesus' miracles were always kind of bound by whatever had been already revealed. Like, well, we know he can do blindness, and we know he can deal with lameness, and well, now we know he can do leprosy too. It's almost like they're listing off like his specialties or something. And the centurion comes along and says, specialty's nothing, it's just authority. And he has authority over all, and so he can do anything and all things. And Jesus is thoroughly impressed. But Jesus is not impressed by his understanding of authority. Jesus marvels at his great faith. See, faith is the thing. But for this centurion, his faith was unlocked when he recognized authority at work. He saw that authority at work, and therefore he could trust that authority to do and be. And so he does, and Jesus marvels at it, as if he's just longing for the rest of us to trust him the way that this centurion trusted him. But I wonder if there's something in the authority that might help us along the way. And you might say, oh, no, I understand Jesus could do anything. I know that. I know he's got the power to do anything at all. But can I just challenge you for a minute to just swap out the word power and put authority in there? Sure, I'll do that, Pastor. Yeah, you bet. Jesus, he has the authority to speak and do whatever it is that is fitting in accordance to the will of God. You bet. I'll do that. Authority. Cool. Now let's just kind of throw ourselves into the equation. Am I fitting into the authority structure? This ties back into what we just saw Jesus saying at the end of chapter 6. Why do you call me Lord? Why do you call me the title for the ultimate authority of all, but don't do the things that I tell you to do? See, because I think that if we really got the authority of Jesus, if we really comprehended, if we really believed it, we would respond the same way that the wind and the waves and the demons and the sickness and the blindness do. There wouldn't be a battle. There wouldn't be a conflict. There would just be a yes, you bet, of course. There's just something unique about man. It's unique to man, I guess, because even the demons tremble. There's something unique about man where we think that somehow submission to authority is optional. That I will submit to the authorities that I agree with. That's not submission, that's agreement. If you're here where you're listening to this message and you have anything to do with anyone learning about authority, then I would encourage you to take that role seriously. Whether it's our children, whether it's teachers in a classroom environment, whatever the situation is. Because when it comes to individuals understanding authority, I'm not just talking about flexing authority, I'm talking about people understanding what authority is, how it works, and yes, they do need to see it at work and experience it. But where there's a lack of authority, there's clearly a lack of fear of God. And for a child who does not understand the authority of a parent, that child will struggle to understand the authority of God over their life. And so we don't do kids any favors by spoiling them or by seeing them as our peers or by somehow making them equals, because they're not equal. They're a child who's been called by God to be in submission to the parents who have been called by God to have God's delegated authority over those children. And so for a child to be raised up with a clear understanding of what authority is and how it works, it'll keep them out of a lot of places that they don't want to go and where you don't want them to be. Everything from a night in jail to eternity in hell. All because of authority and rightly understanding it. But it's not just authority. It's understanding authority in the context of now being able to put our faith in the one who is in authority. So now I said that we were going to cover this in the widow of Nain. Let's just do that because the widow of Nain's sweet, sweet gal. We don't know anything about her. But look, verse 11. Oh, wait, we didn't even finish our story, did we? Never mind, this will take another 10 minutes. Okay. When Jesus heard these things, verse 9, he marveled at him. He turned around to the crowd and followed him. And I say to you, I have not found such great faith, not even in Israel. And those who were sent, returning to the house, found the servant well who had been sick. There's the end of the story. It didn't take 10 minutes. But in verse 11, it says, now it happened the day after that, the next day, that he went into a city called Nain. And many of his disciples went with him, and a large crowd. So there's a crowd following Jesus and his disciples as he's moving into the city of Nain. And when he came near the gate of the city, behold, a dead man was being carried out, the only son of his mother, and she was a widow, and a large crowd from the city was with her. Okay, so what's happening? Jesus is walking with his disciples and a crowd into the city of Nain, and this lady with her dead son is being carried out with a large crowd out of the city of Nain, and we've got two crowds clashing, okay? I don't want you to think it turns violent or anything. It doesn't. But it says here in verse 12 that this is the man who had died was the only son of his mother, and she was a widow. That means that she has no other person in her life to provide for her. She's already lost her husband. She's only got one son, and now he has died. And so this is a widow who has no provision. She has no covering, no protector, no provider. This is important, much different then than today. Today, a woman can kind of get by in that situation. I'm not saying it's what you want. But I'm saying that in our current culture and society, it's possible for a woman to get by. But in that day, this was not a possibility. Okay? So as this woman is coming out of the city grieving the loss of her son, which if you've ever lost anyone, then you understand how difficult it is when you're grieving over the loss of one person on the heels of having lost another. You know, they could call this compounded grief in the sphere of grief. But she's already lost her husband, we don't know when, but now she's lost her son as well. And so she's walking out of that city to bury her son with the sorrow of everything that she has lost that is behind her and the sorrow of the prospect of what is before her. Are you tracking with me? Okay, there's this large multitude with her. We don't know if she's just a really friendly gal and has lots of friends, or if everyone understands this is a dire situation. But so they're coming out of the city. Verse 13, when the Lord saw her, you like that? Not just when Jesus, but when the Lord. This is the Greek word kurios. This is Jesus, Lord, like ultimate authority, okay? When the ultimate authority of all creation, okay, came near the gate of the city. Again, it says that, verse 13. When the Lord saw her, he had compassion on her and said to her, do not weep. Okay? Now, we oftentimes see Jesus responding in these situations with compassion. And I don't know what your concept of compassion is, what your definition of the word might be. The Greek word that's used here speaks of a very deep, heart-wrenching response, okay? And so it's not just kind of like, oh, I should have compassion. Sorry for your loss. You know what I mean? But this is like a deep-hearted, emotional response that Jesus is having here. Compassion's been defined by others as embracing another person's pain within one's own heart. That it's kind of like, I'm taking your pain and I'm embracing it within my own heart. We might think of this in the biblical context of bearing one another's burdens, but in a very deep, sorrowful sense. This is Jesus' response to her. He sees what's happening, and this is his response. He has compassion upon her. And then he says this to her. He says, do not weep. Now, he's not just kind of saying, hey, get it all together, lady. You got a rough time ahead of you. It's no time to cry. It's not that. And in fact, it's probably not even, you don't need to cry, I can fix this. Sometimes we think, why would he be upset when he knows like he can just raise him from the dead? I mean, like what's the delay? I mean, in 2 minutes, you're going to have your son back again. Well, we know that because we've read the story. And Jesus knows that because he knows what he's about to do. But he still takes the time to respond with compassion. That is that he meets people where they're at. He doesn't just lecture them about why they don't need to be there. He doesn't just tell them, listen, everything's going to get better, so stop crying. He has compassion. He's taking her sorrow and he's bearing it within his own heart. It's very similar to weeping as she's weeping, meeting her where she is at. But when he does say to her, do not weep, it's not a command, it's not a lecture, it's not a toughen up, get things together. It's more the indication that there's not a need for you to be weeping. He doesn't just tell her not to cry, he does something about it. He takes her sorrow and turns it into joy. In verse 14, it says that he came and he touched the open coffin. And this, don't think coffin like we think of in a movie or something. It's probably more just a stretcher. The Greek word's kind of very universal for anything dead, like including an urn for cremated ashes, but it's something that's used to carry a dead person. And so he touches that, and this is pretty much understood that him touching that is him stopping the funeral procession. It's kind of like he's stopping the coffin, if you will, from advancing. Okay? And so he touched the open coffin, and those who carried him stood still, so they stop, and then he does it. He says, young man, I say to you, arise. What does he do? He speaks it, commands it. He uses his authority. There's something fascinating about the way that Jesus talks to dead people, isn't it? I mean, because he talks to them. It's not like he's talking to death personified. He's talking to this young man. He speaks to the young man as if the young man still has ears to hear. Guess what? Jesus is Lord over all. And when it comes to Jesus speaking, everything has ears to hear, except maybe mankind. And so he speaks. And the young man obeys. Maybe that's it. Maybe we just have to die in order to obey. Hallelujah. Amen. That's right. That's right. Because that's exactly what we're told. Not that we're going to die physically, but we do need to die to self. When we've been crucified with Christ, that's when life begins. And so he speaks, "Young man, I say to you, arise." So he who was dead sat up and began to speak. Everyone wonders, what did he say? I saw a light. Now, we don't know what he said, okay? But, I mean, it had to be fascinating. I mean, don't you just even wonder what the first words that came out of his mouth were? Were they kind of like your friend when they're coming off of morphine after surgery or something? Hopefully not, okay? Because that's always like, shh. Don't say anything. Yeah. You know, it's always fascinating doing hospital visitations when you guys are on painkillers. It's great. I learn a lot about you. So he speaks, and he, Jesus, presented him to his mother. That's beautiful. Woman, here is your son. He's returned to you. Beautiful. He has compassion. He speaks in his authority. And he returns that which was lost to the woman. Verse 16. Then fear came upon all, and they glorified God, saying, "A great prophet has arisen up among us, and God has visited his people." That's true. And this report about him went throughout all Judea and all the surrounding region. Jesus, he's Lord of all. Praise the Lord. He is Lord over all. And I want you to be encouraged to know that he is Lord right now, today. He is Lord. And in his grace, in his kindness, in his mercy, he has chosen to not exercise his authority in all the ways that he could, nor even all the ways that he will. I'm not sure which of us really want him to exercise his authority over us. The beautiful thing is he's asking you to come, not to discover his authority, but to yield to it, to recognize it, to grow in your awareness of it and how far-reaching it is, and for you to find safety in his authority, for you to take comfort in his rod and his staff as he walks you through the valley of the shadow of death, as well as when he lays you down in green pastures beside still waters. He wants you to take comfort and to find peace in the reality that Jesus is Lord. And we will be grieved when we watch the world and even loved ones living in rebellion against his authority. But may we take comfort in knowing that this is my God, and he has been patient and merciful with me. His grace abounds toward me. And as he delays in his return, his grace continues to abound. That justice would be just postponed that much further. That another person like you might have their eyes opened to the goodness of God and humbly bow before him and call him their Kyrios, my Lord, my ultimate authority. Lord, we thank you. We thank you for your patience. Thank you for your kindness. We thank you for your power. Lord, I pray that we would never fear at the prospect of your authority, but rather embrace the fact that you are in charge. May we declare it regularly to you that you are Lord over my life. May we live it out every moment, doing your bidding, choosing to submit to you and your teaching, your leading, your commands, choosing to love when we don't feel like loving, and choosing to give when we don't feel like giving, choosing to be a sacrifice for others when we don't think them worthy. We thank you, Lord, for choosing to be the sacrifice for us who are not worthy, but ever so blessed by your grace. Be glorified, O Lord God of heaven, in and through your Son, as he continues to draw unto himself those who are lost, that they would be found. We thank you in Jesus' name. Amen.